Less than a century ago, the fantasy genre did not exist. But that is a very misleading truth. What do I mean? Well, there were countless stories that if they were being published today would absolutely be marketed as fantasy for centuries, millennia, all the way back to ancient mythology, the epics of Iliad and the Odyssey, or the tales of King Arthur, even the lore of Beowulf. So what happened? Tolkien happened.
I have come here to chew bubblegum
and write fantasy.
And I'm all out of bubblegum.
In fact, he was inspired by many of these stories. He even did a translation of Beowulf before he inadvertently, not deliberately, invented modern fantasy. But the reason I'm making this video is partially my frustration for people's misunderstanding of what exactly happened here, because it wasn't as simple as Tolkien being inspired by ancient legends and pulling Middle-earth out of vapor. There were contemporaries. There were people publishing within a few decades of Tolkien second world fantasy. The likes of George MacDonald putting out stories like The Princess and the Goblin and Lilith, both of which, yeah, if they were put out now, would be considered fantasy. You also had the worm Ouroboros and the King of the Elfland's Daughter. And while these stories often lacked the structure or feel of what modern fantasy is, that's what they would be labeled if they were dropped now. And Tolkien, I'm sure, was at least somewhat aware, if not having read these stories. Beyond that, there was even the likes of Edgar Rice Burroughs and Conan the Barbarian, already occupying shelves within drugstores. But wait, what? That is actually the even greater impact that Tolkien contributed to that people misunderstand. No, Tolkien did not invent the idea of writing a story taking place in another world. He did start epic fantasy, though, because there were people who just kept making fantasy in the era and the post-wave of Tolkien, and there were thousands of Tolkien clones who just didn't do it as well and struggled with a market, an economy, an audience that wasn't sure how to treat the gold that was just dropped on them. So I want to tell, in this video, the story of the eras of fantasy in terms of the modern genre, because it is both more complicated and simple than people think. Now, I said something there that might sound strange to especially the younger audience here, whose parents might not even be old enough like my dad is to remember going to a drugstore to pick up a pulp magazine to see what John Carter was up to on Mars. This was the era of pulp fiction, with dime novels, junk paper that is the reason why it's so hard to find any of these in somewhat decent condition today. If you think the paperbacks you buy in stores can be easily beat up, you don't know nothing. But Tolkien didn't just go to his publisher and say, put this in a mass market paperback and change the world. And instead, there was a small thing happening at the time called World War II. And an interesting piece of history is within World War II, soldiers were supplied with proto-mass market paperbacks called Armed Service Editions. Over 122 million copies of 1,300 different titles were distributed to service members. This included the likes of H.P. Lovecraft, Mark Twain, H.G. Wells, and so many more. Which isn't to imply people didn't go out and buy, obviously, books to read their fiction before this initiative, but it retrained a massive segment of the market, primarily the breadwinners in households, in terms of their reading habits. And the publishers who provided these titles to the armed forces didn't just stop because the war ended. And of course, right around this time, Tolkien took his fairy tale, The Hobbit, to a publisher, and history was made. At
least that's the lie told to you by fat, filthy publishing. In reality, it's far more complicated.
Anyway, you see, The Hobbit was first released in the 1930s and was successful. It sold out of its original 1,500 print run in 3 months, had good reviews, but was far from a pop culture phenomenon. Lord of the Rings followed it up in the 50s, And while, again, it did well, it still was a bit of a struggle. There's a reason why Tolkien had to change publishers and didn't get his way and had Lord of the Rings split up into 3 different editions. Then something interesting happened. You see, overseas in America, some capitalists decided to do their damn dirty thing. And they decided there was a loophole that allowed them to publish The Lord of the Rings in America through Ace Books without giving any money to Tolkien. And then amazingly, before the internet, before there was even a way for him to directly communicate with his fans, backlash occurred to the point where Ace stopped. They retracted their editions and paid Tolkien a nominal amount of money. But this, of course, helped spread the word. When a mass market paperback edition of The Lord of the Rings was finally done, it sold like crazy. All publicity is good publicity. To be clear, because this is easy to oversimplify and get wrong, Lord of the Rings had success, hence why there were fans who were able to get mad, and there was backlash. But Tolkien apparently didn't want there to be a mass market paperback version of The Lord of the Rings. But then, when he finally gave into it, because he saw how many Ace was selling, that's when The Lord of the Rings sales started to balloon in the millions. But this wasn't until 1965. Tolkien did not make mass market paperbacks the default reading medium. But the rise of mass market paperbacks, once Tolkien aligned with it, helped propel Lord of the Rings so much higher, and vice versa. I'm sure it did good for mass market paperbacks. But mass market paperbacks are not dime novels. They are made higher quality, and this is around the time where these types of stories were actually being put into bookstores. Fantasy sections in bookstores weren't a thing yet and wouldn't be for decades to come, but there's an interesting history here that's far more complicated than Tolkien went to his publisher and had great success.
Now back to the story.
Quick moment of clarification that I know might screw up the tempo and structure of this video, but it's very important to me that I don't become a source of misinformation, especially when it comes to something like The Lord of the Rings. As a framing device joke, I wanted to say like there's some kind of conspiracy where they're trying to hide the fact that this Ace scandal overall kind of helped the success of Lord of the Rings, but that's just not true. In fact, the Tolkien Society and family seem quite proud of this. I mean, why wouldn't they? It doesn't take away any of the accolades that The Lord of the Rings has received over the years, and it just adds to their badge list that they actually had a grassroots campaign from fans to help them before that was ever common. It's just cool. So yeah, this Ace scandal inadvertently did help propel Lord of the Rings, at least commercially, to higher highs than it otherwise would have reached as quickly. Though, with what The Lord of the Rings is, I maintain it probably would have reached that level of success eventually. Beginning a long, long legacy of Tolkien being ahead of the curve, and almost the Middle-earth franchise as a whole being this encapsulation of the story of the modern fantasy genre on its own, because consistently, decades ahead of its time, Tolkien and Middle-earth face the same challenges that modern fantasy successes still do. I'm talking, yes, about issues with publishers, but on top of that, Tolkien paved the way for it to become normal for fantasy series to release supplemental material, the likes of which the Cosmere still do to this day, and even revisions, something that fantasy authors are continually plagued with, but none maybe more so than Middle-earth, because so help me God, if Tolkien scholars find even one small inconsistency, they will release a whole new edition and fix every possible mistake. And you might be thinking that had to have stopped all the way back in the 60s. Nope. A revision to Lord of the Rings was released as recently as 2014, and was actually there in the beginning. The version of The Hobbit that was released after Lord of the Rings had a pretty big change to The Ring to account for the story that was being told in his new trilogy. A trilogy that Tolkien did not want to be a trilogy. But as still happens to the likes of A Song of Ice and Fire, there were also 1,000 copycats. Probably more fantasy copycats happened to Lord of the Rings than any other fantasy writing ever, but a unique feature to Tolkien's success is because of this position he had in the market, he actually inspired publishers to go back to what was being written before him in things like Brothers Grimm and some of these authors who were just writing second world fantasy and begin to market and publish them in ways that they had never been before. And this can be seen in the release of the Ballantine Adult Fantasy Collection, which had so many of these and continued to print these collections for the new fantasy fan market. That, again, Tolkien pioneered. Now, there's going to be comments of people telling me, of course there were fantasy fans before Tolkien. I'm talking in generalities, and I'm talking about the exponential growth of that market as a result. And so these walls are finally broken. The mass market boom really begins to take hold within the 50s and 60s, and with great success comes weird shit. There were two strong reactions I was able to find critically outside of just reviews to Lord of the Rings and its impact on culture. One of which was how the counterculture seemed to eagerly adapt Tolkien's work as a part of their shared literature. That is because within this hippie movement, Tolkien's choice to take a hobbit, a smaller, looked down upon race within Middle-earth, and make them the true hero was seen as a kind of allyship. And on top of that, yeah, hippies weren't that deep, and there's talks of hallucinogens within the pages. And so they went, ha-ha! Let's scroll Frodo lives everywhere, which they did a lot. Weird graffiti choice, but okay. I feel like if Tolkien heard about that, he'd be like, just buy the book.
Goddamn hippie!
Whoa, dude!
Get out of here!
Not cool! What's up?
But jumping ahead a few decades, you also had some of his contemporaries, people who became massively successful in the space, writing pretty big critiques of Tolkien's themes and taking a far different read than the counterculture did. And this comes with, I said weird shit for a reason. Let's talk about the epic poo. I actually think the epic poo is a very important moment in the history of the fantasy genre. Hear me out, and if you don't know what it is, this sounds like a weird segment so far, but Michael Moorcock in the 70s, again, we're jumping ahead a little bit, released an essay where he criticized Middle-earth, and what he had to say kind of comes across like a proto-internet hater. Let's get into some of his most biting commentary. I suppose I respond so antipathetically to Lewis and Tolkien because I find this sort of consolatory orthodoxy as distasteful as any other self-serving, misanthropic doctrine. One should perhaps feel some sympathy for the nervousness occasionally revealed beneath their thick layers of stuffy self-satisfaction, typically of the second-rate schoolmaster, so cheerfully mocked, but sympathy is hard to sustain in the teeth of their hidden aggression, which is so often accompanied by deep-rooted hypocrisy. Their theories dignify the mood of a disenchanted and thoroughly discredited section of the repressed English middle class, too afraid, even as it falls, to make any sort of direct complaint, least of all to the higher authority, their Tory god, who has evidently failed them. This is followed up with excerpts like, "The Lord of the Rings is much more deep-rooted in its infantilism than a good many of the more obviously juvenile books it influenced. It is Winnie the Pooh posing as an epic. If the Shire is a suburban garden, Sauron and his henchmen are the old bourgeoisie bugaboo, the mob, mindless football supporters throwing their beer bottles over the fence, the worst aspects of modern urban society represented as the whole by a fearful, backward-yearning class for whom good taste is synonymous with restraint. And civilized behavior means conventional behavior in all circumstances. This is not to deny that courageous characters are found in Lord of the Rings, or a willingness to fight evil, but somehow those courageous characters take on the aspect of retired colonels, at last driven to write a letter to the Times, and we are not sure, because Tolkien cannot really bring himself to get close to his proles and their satanic leaders, if Sauron and company are quite as evil as we're told. After all, anyone who hates hobbits can't be all bad. And my personal favorite excerpt, writers like Tolkien take you to the edge of the abyss and point out the excellent tea garden at the bottom, showing you the steps carved into the cliff and reminding you to be a bit careful because the handrails are a trifle shaky as you go down. They haven't got the approval yet to put a new one in.
Now let me say I'm the biggest hater. I hate the way that you walk, the way that you talk. I hate the way that you dress.
God damn, Michael Moorcock! One, I largely disagree with your read of the material. Tolkien's politics, as we've come to understand them, looking more and more through what he wrote, are deeply complicated and definitely cannot be simply written down as the modern day understandings of progressive and conservative. A lot of fantasy authors, as I've looked into it, have pretty strange political beliefs, but beyond that, that's the best writing I have ever seen from Michael Moorcock. Burn. I mean that as someone who's a big fan of his writing and the Elric of Menibene series, but you can tell he knew he was taking on Tolkien, and so he punched it up a little bit, and that's an internet comment if I've ever heard one. Far more coherent than most, but that's a hater. Now, before any of you in the comments section start poo-pooing Michael Moorcock for his epic deuce, just remember that this is the guy who wrote the Elric saga and was tackling topics like depression all the way back in 1972, and we would not see that become prominent within the genre for several decades. Yeah, he may not have had the prose of Tolkien, but he could throw hands with him when it came to themes and imagination. And on top of that, I just kind of like that he has these opinions. It adds a lot of sass to his stories, and it's cool to see this other perspective trying to come in to see what the fantastical genre can do and be. All of this to say, Tolkien not only invented the modern genre, but he forecast where it was to go until recently. Because as we push out of the 60s and 70s and more into the 80s, we stop just getting detractors and copycats, and we get authors who do some really interesting stuff with the modern fantasy genre that springboards from Tolkien and manages to become more of its own thing. We see the likes of Earthsea, which reject the black and white morality that is absolutely present within Middle-earth, and instead refuses to have a simple antagonist villain and becomes far more internal, using, actually kind of complementary to what Moorcock was saying, the fantastical as a way to challenge the self. Frank Herbert's Dune showed us what science fantasy can be, and the Chronicles of Amber helped solidify sci-fantasy as a mainstream genre in its own right. But pushing out of purely the book space, yeah, the genre of fantasy is bigger than that. And we also see the gamification of fantasy become much more popular with the release of the likes of Dungeons and Dragons, which pioneered adapting fantasy not only into an RPG, but later on pushing the bounds into the video game space. And then as a whole, we saw fantasy adaptations of movies start getting serious mainstream, big budget success, and that has resulted in many of the most popular shows and movies of the last several decades. Paralleling as well the overall gamification of the fantasy genre, not only because we are literally seeing the rise of home computers begin, and yeah, there's text-based adventures happening, but Dungeons and Dragons hits the scene. Dragonlance follows, and the gamification, the franchiseification of fantasy is in full swing. While it's not the most popular series to look at, Dragonlance as a whole, if you want to track not only the books but everything that springs up around them, really is a beautiful encapsulation of how the 80s bleeding into the 90s allowed fantasy to really aggressively become gamified and franchiseified, that's a word. And these two factors paralleling each other keep the genre maybe healthier than ever in my opinion, and that's because also Shannara hits the scene and shows us that Tolkien clones will always be popular. Animation began to, yes, adapt Lord of the Rings, but also bring life to fantasy stories across the board. And once anime started making its way to the Western world, because we're doing a Western perspective on fantasy, obviously, Japan began to shift how we interpret the visualizations and storytelling of this world. A whole lot of the big movie makers of this era start to cite anime as an influence of their movies, especially those that start making fantasy films. Some of them also start just straight up treading into the rip-off territory, but that's another video. It's important to note though, it's not all about the big business. There are also just standout smash successes that are finding mainstream appeal because they're just quality fantasy stories, and the market has adjusted to push them to the proper audiences, and this includes Discworld, which, yes, has had adaptations. None of them have anything to do with its success, though. That's the nicest way I can put that. But really, once we move from the 80s into the 90s, we begin to encounter what would be considered modern fantasy stories. And the trademark of modern fantasy is why I actually prefer the current state of the genre over many of the classics while loving and respecting them. But many authors, you can kind of just feel it, begin looking far beyond just the influences of Tolkien, but other literature as well, and bringing it into their make-believe worlds. And again, I'm speaking in generalities. I would even say Michael Moorcock was ahead of the curve on this, but it becomes far more common. And from the 80s to the 90s, as we as a society come to understand psychology and so much more, all the stronger, that begins to affect the fantasy books released as well. And it's why I personally do tend to prefer 80s and onward fantasy and science fiction. Again, I'm speaking in generalities. I know they're not connected, but it is funny to me how not long after Michael Moorcock released the epic Pooh, 80s onward did kind of pull away from that style of fantasy storytelling and got a lot more psychological and cynical. Not saying everything's grimdark, but it became far less commonly cut and dry evil and good. In fact, I would say stories that have that moral viewpoint from the 90s onward almost become rare. But it becomes the mainstay standard to not just have characters go off on a wonderful adventure and come back happy, but to make them deeply personally affected by what's happening around them, and that emotional impact take up a substantial amount of the spotlight. We end up getting stories like Riftwar, The Bulgarian, Memory, Sorrow, Thorn, Black Company, later on Wheel of Time, Farseer, A Song of Ice and Fire. Rewind a little bit. Can we all take a moment to appreciate the fact that Tad Williams has been publishing epic fantasy books since the 80s, is still doing so, and killing it. This, Memory, Sorrow, Thorn, I might need to do a full deep dive into this, might just be the most well-sustained fantasy franchise ever in terms of just sticking to the middle of the road, being quality, and a standard bearer, which is how you keep a genre healthy. Publishers like Tor, Del Rey, and Daw hit the scene, specifically just focusing on maximizing the success of the fantasy genre. One more note, with Black Company hitting the scene, the true antithetical to what Tolkien's tone was fantasy also becomes a staple, mainstay, regularly appearing part of the genre, and that's grimdark, inspiring so many authors I've talked to. So many grimdark authors. Actually, I might just say every single one has directly referenced Glenn Cook's Black Company. Again, seeds were planted, then it became a regular thing. But things really get strange once we start moving from the 90s into the 2000s, not only because we get the release of the likes of Perdido Street Station and new weird becomes a genre, experimentation is now being more commonly accepted by publishers, not only because the discrimination of who exactly they will publish is somewhat dying down, but also it's being proven that you can do weird shit in fantasy a lot, and people will buy it. But then, the two biggest bangs the fantasy genre has had since Tolkien happen borderline simultaneously. And as Tolkien benefited from the mass market boom happening with the release of The Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter benefits from the internet. Holy God. So I'm old enough to remember a time when the internet was not crowded. It was a very empty thing, and if a new video popped off and went viral, everybody saw that one video. We would all show up the next day talking about the evolution of dance guy, which, I don't know if you've watched that recently, not impressive. Does not age very well. He dances okay to a few different styles, and when I was a kid, this shit blew my mind. Fan forums and more begin propelling Harry Potter to the top of the algorithm equivalent back then, which was kind of just, hey, this is doing well, let's share it. That's what the companies would do before algorithms pushed everything. They'd go, hey, this is getting a strong reaction. Push it more. It was far more manual of a process. And so what would have likely just been a Percy Jackson equivalent level of success skyrocketed to shattering records. And I know J.K. Rowling has proudly shown that she's a piece of shit. Diminishing the impact and success of Harry Potter is not punishing her and is kind of just ludicrous to do. It still holds so many records, an absurd number of them in terms of book sales, adaptation, shattering, everything. Oh my God. I remember remember the lines around multiple blocks of my local Barnes and, oh no, it was a Borders, whenever there was a new Harry Potter book coming out. It went all the way around. And then we also had internet culture showing up to ruin it, because there were people who would do drive-by screaming spoilers at people. Snape killed Dumbledore was a proto-meme, because people are dicks. Fan fiction becomes a thing, and that needs its own video as well, AO3. I'll dive into it one day. Internet legends, I would argue, become a kind of fantasy as well. Slenderman, a modern urban legend and fantasy tale. But during and after the 2000s, weird thrives, and also so does somewhat lower fantasy. Don't get me wrong, like the Cosmere is here and bigger and more epic than ever, but we have Gentlemen Bastards, which just feels not as epic. It's an urban fantasy that's not modern, becoming one of the most popular fantasy series out there. But another strange thing happens to fantasy. Not only does it get far more political, and we see successes like N.K. Jemisin kind of redefine political commentary in the fantastical, we also see urban and paranormal fantasy begin floating from kind of a rare subgenre to a mainstay as well, with obviously the TV show Buffy the Vampire Slayer giving a massive help, but also Dresden Files and Supernatural becoming borderline household names. People who would never pick up Lord of the Rings for some strange reason were really okay checking those out. Then we have the aftershocks of Harry Potter, Twilight, 50 Shades of Grey, so many other franchises that are just tangentially kind of related to each other. I know, I've seen the 9/11 Twilight thing. It's weird. For anyone who has not seen that, you know what? I'm not going to explain it. Way funnier if I don't. And I will always argue the internet boom is a good thing for the fantasy genre, not only because it gave permission for people to be weirder than ever, but it gave microphones to voices who would have never had them before. Safe spaces for queer communities to share stories, dominate circles that cannot be oppressed, and normalize having gay characters in a way that actually forced mainstream publishing to start far more often releasing books with gay protagonists. Mainly because they saw the money. But the most consistent element permeating the fantasy genre I have noticed since the internet became the dominating way to find success, get published, grow a fandom, even write your story within online communities, is that we're cycling through genres faster than ever. Grimdark and cozy fantasy have come and gone in peak popularity since I started my channel. And now we're seeing things like lit RPG just balloon to a level of pop culture understanding faster than any genre has before. What would take nearly a decade to become something that bubbles to the top of the genre and something deeply associated with the word fantasy can almost hit like lightning. And that is because of maybe a possibly bad result of the internet taking such a strong hold. There's a reason there's an A for Audible and a K for Kindle. I know I've talked about it too much, don't worry, this will be brief. But you cannot talk about fantasy as a whole. You cannot talk about fiction, books, from like 2015 onwards without acknowledging that the algorithms behind these platforms essentially dictate what becomes the most popular series on most devices. Audiobooks are the fastest growing way to consume books in the modern age, redefining kind of what it means to read, and there's still some people who are really pissed off about that. And authors begin to even write books with the intent of tagging them to properly hit in these algorithms and even structure them to be easier to adapt to TV shows. Multiple authors have told me this and asked me not to say their names, so I won't. But yeah, if you are trying to write something that will be grabbed by a studio to be adapted, you possibly avoid some really expensive concepts that could just exist in your story forever. There's a reason you're less likely to find something as bizarre and set twisting as Elric of Manibene would be released now, because they know, well, that would just kind of restrict me to being an animated adaptation, and the big money's in live action, baby. Overall, though, I love the internet age for publishing in fantasy because we're seeing more often fantasy authors actually get the critical and awarded acclaim they do deserve. Snobbery against the genre, again, kind of died just in my time on the channel. I'm not saying I had anything to do with that. I'm just saying, like, since I started, I used to have people kind of make fun of me for talking about fantasy to just aggressively asking me for recommendations. But this takes me back to the start of the video. I put this black line here at the start of the internet for a reason. I think there is a post-Tolkien fantasy. I also think there's going to be a post-internet fantasy. The further we get from the early 2000s and the effects that it's had on publishing as a whole, it's changed the landscape so drastically. It's just dead wrong to say that fantasy put out in the 70s has the same intent, the same market strategy, the same influences, the same understanding of what it even means to be fantastical than what's put out now. Authors are having their creativity and intent informed by what's marketable and algorithmically possibly successful in a way that I think would make Tolkien vomit. It actually kind of gets back to the original actual theming within the Lord of the Rings of anti-industrial and not liking the modernization that's happening, and even the potential sequel he thought about writing at some point but said it was too sad because that guy is never going to write grimdark. So my overall end message here is I actually think we're turning a very important page. I think from the 40s until the 90s to 2000s, a couple of years from now is going to be looked at as one era. And then there's going to be a before Tolkien, and there's going to be a after the internet. And that's kind of scary, but I'm excited about it. There's going to be influences on what you're reading that might put a bad taste in your mouth, like, oh, this book was written because romantasy is super popular, so it wasn't like pure artistic intent, but those are bumps. And we have more freedom than ever. And that kicks ass. Though, I will say, it seems romantasy is here to stay. Again, I could do a whole other video on that, but porn, especially in the age of the internet, has staying power. So we're going to see subgenres of romantasy continue to flash in and out. But romantasy, that's going to be a word you're going to be hearing until you die. But let me know what you think of my take on how the fantasy genre went from being just this scattering of fairy tales that weren't even really seen as connected to having one tremendous influence come out and shape an era of fantasy that now really seems to be at a flux point. And we're in the immediate aftermath of it, in the same way that the authors of the 50s were in the aftermath of Tolkien. Like and subscribe if you have not already. Hit the Patreon if you want to support what I do here.
And I love you.